Welcome everybody to this seminar. We are delighted to welcome John Baily to be with us. John Baily is one of our most senior and distinguished fellows who's done the most extraordinary work over many decades in Afghanistan, accompanied by his wife, and has a profound understanding of the music, religion and culture of the region. And so we are very, very privileged to have him with us today, and we look forward to his paper. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a real pleasure to be back here after quite a while. It's been a really happy discussion. And welcome to you all. This is a topic that has been with me for many years, and this is a good opportunity for me to give some presentation. I've written about some of it here and there, but I've never actually given this as a seminar. So during the later part of the 19th century, the court music of Kabul was a modified and simplified version of Hindustani classical music with its melodic modes and ragas and with its rhythmic cycles such as Chintal and blah, blah, blah. Various genres of Hindustani vocal music were performed at the court, such as Khyal, Tumri, Tarana, and Ghazal. Mainly vocal, this music was performed to the accompaniment of the hand-pumped Indian harmonium, invented, I learned recently, in 1875, for tampura, the sarangi, bowed lute, and tabla. In Kabul, Hindustani genres became mixed with elements of Khorasanian, i.e. Persian music, and with indigenous Afghan vernacular music, particularly that of the Pashtun community. In due course, the ghazal became the predominant genre of Afghan art music, with classical poetry drawn from some of the great poets of the Persianate world, such as Rumi, Hafez, Lahori, Kafishi, and many others. So this is the music that flourished at the court of the emirs from the later part of the 19th century. These Hindustani elements were introduced by members of musician families who migrated to Kabul in the later part of the 19th century from cities such as Lahore and Patiala. They were initially invited by Shah Ali Khan after the Treaty of Ambala and were assigned residences in an area of the old city of Kabul near the royal palace, if the Bola Hissar can be traced with such a term, which was known as the kharâbât, or more simply as the kharâbât. And this word is central to my paper today. Hamid Debashi, professor of Iranian studies and comparative literature at Columbia University, writes, Persian literary historians have concurred that the word kharâbât originally meant a house or tavern of ill repute, but was eventually appropriated by mystics to mean a place that they frequented by way of suspending all hypocritical pretense of piety. The idea is that there are places that you can frequent that will dissemble your beliefs, and yet in doing so will also restore your faith. And the proverbial tavern in Persian poetry is kharâbât. A number of illustrious musician families settled in the kharâbât, also identified by name as the descendants of their ancestor. The Afghan musicologist Professor Ahmad Starmast provides family trees of 5 of these families in his PhD thesis. They were the descendants of Mir Gamuddin, a tabla player whose descendants were wont to add Chishti to their names. There was the family of Karim Bakhsh, the family of Satuju, father of the celebrated Ustad Khatem. There was Karim Khan, grandfather of Ustad Nebi Gol, and Ustad Gulam Hussain, whose son spent 16 years later as the disciple of Ustad Sheikh Ali Khan, one of the leading vocalist ustads in the Patiala style. Back in Kabul, the son became the leading classical singer, given the title Sarahang by the Afghan government at the time. The Ustad Shagird master-pupil relationship with a string-tying ceremony with Gurmani was an important part of the protocols of the kharâbât, as was respect for seniority at gatherings of kharâbât musicians, such as asking for permission to play before performing at such a gathering of musicians. In due course, the music that developed in Kabul around the beginning of the 20th century spread to other urban centers, as Ustad Nebi Gul, one of the luminaries of the kharâbât, lived for a while in Herat in the 1930s and trained local musicians in these new genres of Kabuli music, with whom I then worked in my fieldwork in the 1970s. This was the Khushnawaz family, Amir-Jan Khushnawaz and his son, Mohammed Rahim, who we actually see in the picture here, playing the rubab. My experience of the kharâbât during my 2 years of ethnomusicological fieldwork during the 1970s was limited to 2 months at the start of my residence in Afghanistan. While waiting to be granted a research permit, the king, Zahir Shah, having just been deposed by his cousin Dawood Khan, I started to learn what many considered to be the national instrument of Afghanistan, the plucked lute called rubab, from Ustad Muhammad Amar, the doyen of rubab players. I attended his weekly informal workshops for amateur rubab students at his house in the kharâbât. Later on, being Ustad Muhammad Amar's pupil in this sense gave me status as a researcher. Once I was living in the kharâbât, I had occasional opportunities to hear the music of the kharâbât as performed by musicians from there, famous singers such as Ustad Rahim Bakhsh, Haji Hamahang, and Amir Muhammad would be engaged to perform every night in Herat during Ramadan to paying audiences. There I would hear great musicians from the kharâbât performing ghazals and occasional khiyals or taranas, as well as currently popular songs from the field of popular music, hits from Radio Afghanistan, from Iran, and Indian film music. When I first arrived with my wife, Veronica, the Kabuli singer Amir Muhammad had such a residency for a month in, we can show the big picture now, for a month at the Goldsmiths Hotel. This is just part of that picture.
It's not on the screen yet.
There we are, there's the full picture, but we, let's have the whole lot.
Yeah. Why is it zooming? Okay. There we go.
That's fine. I point out the portrait of Dawood Khan prominently displayed on the wall in the appropriate fashion. Well, here is Amir Muhammad. This is on his right, playing the dutar is Gada Muhammad, one of my principal helpers with learning and playing the dutar. And on his left, Rahim Khushnawaz, one of the outstanding rubab players of his time. And behind is, I think, Amir Muhammad's father playing the tambura. And there is a tabla player there, you can't really see the tabla, who Amir Muhammad has also brought from Kabul for this month's engagement in the Goldsmiths Hotel. So I had the opportunity to hear and record Amir Muhammad on numerous occasions during the next 2 years of fieldwork in Herat, at Ramadan concerts, at wedding parties, on several occasions at private lunch parties in our house in Herat. And several years later, I decided to put a collection of Amir Muhammad's ghazals and other classical pieces together on an audio cassette, and looked around to find somebody who could transcribe and translate the lyrics. This collection included Jân-e Kharabatam. At the time, in the 1980s, it proved very difficult to find someone sufficiently knowledgeable about Persian poetry to identify and transcribe the verses as sung by Amir Muhammad, someone who also had the command of English required to translate the text and to comment upon them, and with the time and devotion to undertake such a task. In 1989, I found such a person I needed in the USA. I was then an associate professor and the Center of Ethnomusicology at Columbia University in New York. While in Virginia, visiting Afghan friends from Herat and Kabul, I met again a young man who, as a boy, had helped me with my Dutar research in 1974, at a time when he was learning to play the instrument. When I met him again, this highly educated young man was making a living driving a taxi based at Washington Airport. I mentioned my project to him and he expressed a willingness to help me. So I sent him a copy of the Ghazals cassette with 11 songs on it. And some weeks later, I received from him a 50-page handwritten manuscript with Persian transcriptions of the text, Romanized transliterations, translations in English, and explanations and comments. A fantastic gift. In response to my appreciation for his work, he asked me not to reveal his identity, writing, "If you ever publish that manuscript, please do not use my real name. Either do not mention my name altogether, or if you have to, give me an anonymous name. I insist on this because of my Sufi beliefs. Publication of a Sufi's name in a widely circulated journal or book brings fame and publicity. Fame begets conceit, and conceit destroys humility and faith. That is why I don't like my name to be published in a journal or book." So, in deference to his wishes, I refer to him simply as my anonymous scribe. I relied entirely on his transcriptions and translations as the basis for a short monograph entitled Songs from Kabul, the Spiritual Music of Ustad Amir Muhammad, along with a CD in the back of the book with 8 of the pieces I've recorded. For present purposes, I have selected track 4 from this CD, the Jân-e Kharabatam, Janan-e Kharabatam, which was recorded at a wedding party in Herat on the 7th of November, 1976. So we are now going to, I've got mixed up here. Let's hear this now, please.
گاهرشگاه کرسی گاه نفیگه اثباتم گاه مسجد و گاه دایرم گاه کعبه و میرقاتم خلاص شنو و یارف از رمز مقالاتم من آینه ذاتم خورشید سماواتم چون جان خراباتم جانان خراباتم چون جان خراباتم جانان خراباتم چون جان خراباتم بنده پیر خراباتم که لطفش دائم است ورنه لطف شیخ و زاید گاهی است و گاهی نیست. چون جان خراباتم جانان خراباتم، چون جان خراباتم جانان خراباتم، چون جان خراباتم. افتادن و برخاستن باده پرستن در مذهب رندان خرابات نماز است. چون جان خراباتم جانان خراباتم، چون جان خراباتم. چون گشته هیونا پرده بر رخ حضرت جستم ز همه اکوان اندر تو کیزد بربسته تمامی رخت عظمت رسه کسرت این خرقه هستی را در میکده حیوانت های 100 بار گرو کردم اوریان خراباتم، 100 بار گرو کردم اوریان خراباتم، 100 بار گرو کردم اوریان خراباتم، اوریان خرابات، اوریان خراباتم، اوریان خرابات، چون جان خراباتم. لباس کن قدر آل دل را کم نمی سازد اگر جوهر شناسی تیغ را حوریان تماشا کن. 100 بار گرو کردم حوریان خراباتم، 100 بار گرو کردم. ورزود و رهایی نیست او شاق و را مطلب خورشید صفت قلبم افتاده به تاب و تب معشوقه هم جانان این اسم را مطلب در خانه هم صوفی رو مطلب کم شب با یار خراباتی میمان خراباتم، با یار خراباتی میمان خراباتم، با یار خراباتی.
well, according to our anonymous scribe, the poem is a mosamat, a form of classical Persian poetry, which consists of a series of short stanzas. He writes that it contains very difficult mystic and philosophical terms whose understanding and explanation requires vast knowledge. I do not claim, he says, that I understand and can explain this poem fully. Nonetheless, I give it a try. It should be added that this exalted and enigmatic mosamat was originally sung beautifully and flawlessly by the late Ustad Sarahang on Radio Afghanistan. In fact, it turns out from other sources that this poetry is from, I think, a 19th century poet, you may know better than I do, Mastan Shah Kabuli, and that the music was composed by Ustad Hashim Chishti from the kharâbât. Our anonymous scribe gives his own account of the meanings of the word kharâbât. Throughout this mosamat, he says, kharâbât is the key word. The word has many literary and even colloquial meanings in Farsi, but here it means desolation and desolated place. It also means a tavern, a place in which wine is sold and served in former times. In Sufi terminology, it is an important and frequently used word which implies the desolation and destruction of Sufi self and will, and actions and epithets, and his complete subjugation and subordination and obedience to God. Sheikh Muhammad Dahaji, who was a great Sufi theoretician of the 10th century, writes, kharâbât means union. It means union of actions, of epithets, and of essence. The beginning stage of kharâbât is the destruction of actions and epithets in all animate and inanimate creatures. And kharâbâti is the carefree divine lover and wayfarer who considers all actions and epithets of everyone and everything emanating from and originating in God. Kharâbât also means, according to our scribe, a place in which wine was sold and served in former times. According to Sufi terminology, wine signifies the spiritual intoxication by the appearance and manifestation of God in the Sufi's heart. Well, that's all I have to say about this particular song, but let's go on to Afghanistan after 1978. My wife Veronica and I were privileged to live and work in Herat in the final stages of 45 years of relative peace and freedom in Afghanistan. This ended with the communist coup of Taraki in 1978. In 1979, Taraki was assassinated in a rival communist coup, and after the brief presidency of Hafizullah Amin, Babrak Kemal came to power with strong Russian support, and the invasion of Soviet forces to support the communist regime began. We now have the period of Mujahideen resistance against the Soviet invasion, with the eventual withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1989. This was followed by a civil war between rival Mujahideen parties that lasted until the Taliban took over in 1994. It was during this civil war period that much of Kabul was destroyed. The kharâbât was in the line of artillery fire between different Mujahideen factions. In 2001, the Taliban were defeated by the USA in response to the 9/11 attacks on New York. In 2002, I went to Kabul to investigate the current state of music. I soon caught up with rubab player Gulam Hussain, a denizen of the kharâbât, who I'd first known when I became student of Ustad Muhammad Amar 30 years earlier. He used to serve the tea during the ustad's workshops for amateur rubab players. Gulam Hussain was a true Bache kharâbât and now a senior member of the kharâbât community. He gave me a conducted tour of the ruins of the musicians' quarter.
This street leads to the kharâbât, the musicians' quarter in the old city. That's where I used to go for my rubab lessons with master musician Ustad Muhammad Omar. I know that it lies in ruins, destroyed in the fighting between rival mujahideen groups after the fall of the communists. Nearly all the ustads still alive are outside Afghanistan, like Ustad Asef, who lives in London.
خانه الفتاهنگشان است فضلی آمدشان به نام یک کوچه است صاحب که در این کوچه اینجا یک میدانی بود صاحب این پدرای ما قسم میکردن که در اینجا صاحب چاچا فتح چاچا محمود استاد قاسم استاد غلام حسین اینا صاحب در اینجا دنگلای موسیقی میشد که همه دنگلای موسیقی بود توی هنرمندا میشد تو فکر نمیکردن که توی است یا میگفتن کدام دنگل موسیقی است کل اوری سفیدا بزرگا استادا صاحب در این منطقه در این میدانی صاحب یعنی میگه محفلای عروسی ها رو برپا میکردن حالا صاحب ببینه که چی شده هیچ کس نمونده صاحب یعنی از این پیشترش اون طرف میریم خانه استاد رحیم بخش است خانه استاد شیداست
یا خانه پدری استاد رحیم بخش است
این خانه پدریشان است از استاد رحیم بخش
چیز محمودین چاچا محمودین چاچا محمودین پدر استاد رحیم بخش چاچا محمودین هم داشت
بریم صاحب تو سلام
Gulam Hussain plays the rubab and sounds just like our teacher, Ustad Muhammad Omar. He's younger than me. He used to serve the tea when I had my music lessons in Ustad's house. Now he's back after 10 years of exile in Pakistan.
آقای جان اینی داخل خود خانه استاد مادمر است اینجا اگر به یاد داشته باشین اینی اتاق بود تعلیم خانه بود شما هم اینجا آمدین می آمدین اینجا درستان هم میگرفتین یعنی اینجا
همی
بله اینجا اینجا رایش اینجاست رایش تو بود نی اینجا ورس اینجا ورسی بود نی شما می آمدین بالا سرش دیگه خانه بود دبام که تو تیر میشیدن اینجا دیگه خانهش بود بیستان اولیش بود یعنی خانه استاد مادمر از خانه استاد هاست سعی کنی ببینی
همینجا سرای بود ها؟
بله بله اینجا سرای بود اینجا خانه بود
یک درخت هم بوده میجاست
بله به فکر من هسته
و یاد داری همه چیزه
بله اینجا کل چیز یادشون هست
So this is where I first learnt to play the rubab all those years ago.
این در خانه شما چندین مراتب آمدین بر درستان آمدین خصوصا آصف جان خوی بیخی بلد از یک قدر آمده اینجا باز اونا کاکا میگفتن هرچی نباشن ری سفید بزرگ بودن یعنی همون تو که یعنی آصف جانشان یا ری سفید ها را قدر میکنن ما میگیم تو آصف جان ها را قدر میکنیم یعنی تو ری سفید های ما یا ما ری سفید های ماستن یعنی بزرگا رفت صاحب از ما یک کس نمونده یک آجی امانگ مونده یا در جمله ری سفیدا مونده است دیگه خلاص است بعد دیگه که نمی آصف جان است عارف جان است امروز استاد عاشق خدا طریق رحمتش کنه پروردگار از او کس نمونده یک آصف جان عارف جان مونده ما مجبور هستیم اینمینا را صاحب احترام کنیم قدر کنیم یعنی می ری سفیدای ما بزرگای ماست فرض مثال الطاف حسین می باشه بچه استاد ساران اونا یادشان بخیر الفتاهنگ اینی باز بچه‌ای که از کوچه ماست صاحب
Well, besides identifying the ruins, Gulam Hussain pointed out the younger generation of musicians' obligation to pay their respects to the elders of the kharâbât community and to recognize that his generation of musicians are themselves becoming elders and should be respected and honored in turn. This indicates an awareness of the Kharâbâtians as a distinct community with its own identity. My report on the state of music in Kabul in post-Taliban era recommended that the classical music of Kabul was in urgent need of support. I submitted my report to the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and was appointed as a part-time consultant to their music initiative in Central Asia to set up a tradition bearers program to teach the music of the kharâbât. This I did in 2003, appointing 4 distinguished ustads from the kharâbât: Ustad Salim Bakhsh, vocal; Ustad Gulam Hussain, rubab; Ustad Amruddin Del Ruba, and Ustad Wali Nabizadeh on tabla. I administered the school from London, with Mrs. Roya Affolter looking after local administration. After 2 years, I retired from my position, and after a long search for somebody suitable, Mirwais Siddiqui, who is here with us today, took over the administrative role and transformed these humble beginnings into a fully fledged music school teaching Afghan music, both classical and vernacular. In 2006, I made another visit to Kabul. Much of the city had been rebuilt, including the kharâbât, and a nearby business street, Sangtaroshi, had become a center for music shops and business premises for musicians. Here is Rassem Bakhsh from the kharâbât, taking me up to his office to sing for me. Okay. سلام استاد.
خیر جور هستی؟
نداری؟
جور هستی انشالله. طبیعت خوب.
خوبه.
شکر.
خب بامایی.
آقا جانم خانه مجبور
آقا چه پیامانی پیش مسعودم تیر بیر میکنه خود از پیش ما.
جانیم.
آنواش کی میگه که خیره ها خاله پیشت کار ما. یا زمون خاطر دیگه نمدی بسر دفترم.
من کتاب چه نخوانم.
داری. ولمه.
یا.
یک آهنگ است برای وطن است، برای میهن ما دیگه است.
وطن به نام بلندی تو افتخار کنم، برای خدمتی تو جان خود نثار کنم. تو هستی میهنم مای شیران، تو هستی مسکنون جای دل ایران، تو هستی مسکنون جای دل ایران.
جده ابو حنیفه از تو بوده کی بوده از خواجه سی یاران پروان تو هستی میهنم ماوای شیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو را بود با علی سینای بلخی طبیب و عالم و ممتاز دوران تو هستی میهنم ماوای شیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران اگرچی کابلت میدان جنگ بود نمیمانی در این آل پریشان اگرچی کابلت میدان جنگ بود نمیمانی در این آل پریشان تو هستی میهنم ماوای شیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران تو هستی مسکن و جای دلیران
ساز خدا نشنیدم حاله
او از خود مسیح همه کمپوزیاش در کسیتا خواندیم در کسیتا تیپ کسیت
برای وطن است دیگه برای وطن و ساز زیباست برای
رادیو میمانه برای وقت از کسیتا گرفتم
تشکر سب
تشکر شما
زحمت کشید
مهربانی ای تو خود رفیق ماسی دیگه ما خوب از خودت دوست داریم هم مگی بچه ها شما را زیاد دوست دارم
آواز شما بسیار زیباه clearly his song was not a song about Sufism. There was no mention of the kharâbât. It's a nationalist song, a celebration of one's birthplace, a country, a culture. Qasim Bakhsh is, I believe, from the kharâbât. He's a protege of Ustad Rahim Bakhsh through the protocols of the kharâbât's Ustad Shagird system of apprenticeship, and has adopted Bakhsh as part of his own name. This leads us to the matter of the kharâbât in the diaspora. Of course, also seen in its time, it has, real optimism for the future, and optimism, obviously, that failed to materialize properly. So the diasporic kharâbât, we need to go back to Jân-e Kharabatam and to think about its role in the Afghan diaspora today. At one level, the musicians of the kharâbât constitute a guild, comparable in some ways to guilds such as weavers, woodworkers, jewelers, tailors, potters, etc. A guild is an association of craftsmen or merchants formed for mutual aid and protection and for the furtherance of their professional interests. Implicit in the guild structure are the distinctions between apprentice, a journeyman, and master craftsman. In the world of the kharâbât, these are the distinctions between the status of shagird, khalifa, and ustad. Mixed up with this amongst the kharâbâti community, then are also the rituals involved in an ustad formally accepting a new student through a formalized mutual feeding of sweetmeats and the tying of a cord or strip of fabric around the student's wrist. Graduating from shagird to khalifa status is perhaps less clearly formalized, and certainly in the past, in the recent past, acquired the agreement or the suggestion of the Ministry of Culture in Kabul. The kharâbât as a social entity embodies in spiritual terms the classical music of Afghanistan, the poetry, and above all, the Sufi ideology that goes with it. It embodies a type of classical music that involves a knowledge of sound analysis, names, melodic modes, rhythmic patterns, a repertoire, and a recognized apprenticeship system. The kharâbât community, its spiritual underlay, is a community with its own ideology and protocols of behavior in the domain of music. And now we have the global kharâbât, manifest in Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and various other countries where musicians from the kharâbât have found refuge. Do they still constitute the kharâbât? What does Miroy Siddiqui have to say on this matter, I wonder? And there are many Afghan musicians in exile who have no connection with the kharâbât at all. I come to the end of my peroration. I was wondering a few days ago how to finish this seminar. Out of the blue, I received an email from an Afghan living in Pakistan, Peshawar. When I opened the attachment, there was Gulam Hussain playing Jân-e Kharabatam on the rubab at a small gathering in Jân-e. And here it is. Okay, well, that's it, folks. If you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's so once more to our online colleagues, sorry that if you've not got the audio visuals, we don't know quite how or why that happened, but please do feel free to send in your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll begin our discussion around the table, and then we'll come to you online. Thank you, John. That was absolutely marvelous. It gives us such a lovely snapshot of the way that a musical tradition can be created within a certain context and then spread out from it. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Of course, one with also a very, very particular orientation, which is equally interesting. So I suppose that is right at the heart of the matter, which is how does something spread and what is it being re-embedded into when it does? So the context of the creation of the musicians' quarter in the first place is obviously wide Afghan society at that time, the need for musicians at weddings, the need for musicians with a certain kind of religious ceremony, certain tolerance of their being there within that particular religious framework at that time. But how does all that work in the modern world, in this dispersion? How do they find their new niches?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because I haven't done any research on this matter, of course. But this partly arises from an initiative from the University of Sussex that was looking at minorities from Kabul, from Herat, from what were the other two? Bukhara and Syria. Okay, yes. So from these, but these are places that, particularly the latter two, research had been done. Now, in the case of Kabul, the research being carried out is on the Sikh community in London and looking at how that Sikh community continues, obviously, its kind of Sikh religion, but also its memories and the kind of manifestation of that past culture. And I haven't done the field work to see how that would work here. And this is kind of something that I'm trying to encourage our dear friend here to put his shoulder to the wheel on, and in a way he's doing it already because he is in touch. I mean, I want you to tell us what you're doing in Germany just a minute, but he is in touch with people like Gulam Hussain and many others. And just to say that he ran this Aga Khan music school in Kabul most successfully, and in doing that he became the employer of all of these musicians and got to know them extremely well. So like your family.
Yes, it is indeed.
Can I ask you to speak on that?
Yeah, I had this privilege to work with them during 16 years of my position as a country director of this initiative, the country, because first the school was in Kabul, then we extended to Herat, and we wanted to go to Mazar and Kharâbât, but security situation didn't allow. This minority, these are a minority, these kharâbâti musicians, and these kharâbâti musicians belonging to a particular social souche in French, I don't know what is in English, social category of people in Afghanistan. They arrived from India, as you mentioned, we all know, and established in Kharâbât for 250 years or more, and they are the retainer of this intangible knowledge and cultural heritage. Somehow, which I mentioned in one of my papers, that they have to be recognized as a particular social category, and their art and music culture should be somehow inscribed as a intangible cultural heritage in part of UNESCO somehow. That is what I suggest, that I would love to see this. The Kharâbâti musicians network, it does exist throughout maybe these two continents, in Europe and America. In Australia, there are musicians, but they are not Kharâbâti from blood. You just before starting the program, you asked me if there are other people who belong to Kharâbât. Yes, even Ustad Muhammad Umar was from Kabul. He wasn't from Kharâbât itself. He became Kharâbâti by becoming a student of Kharâbât. Such as us, Dawood Khan Saduzai, you mentioned the name, student of Ustad Muhammad Umar. His father was a commerciant of antiques, and he became a student of Ustad Muhammad Umar and became a very famous rubab player in Europe, in Germany, and also in Greece. So there are families, even Qasim Bakhsh's father came from Mazar Sharif, from northern Afghanistan. And as he was lover of singing, and he became the student of Ustad Sarahan, and his name, after the name of Sarahan, was Hayrat Ahang. Arif Hayrat Ahang was the father of Qasim Bakhsh. They established themselves also in Kuche Kharabat and became Kharâbâti, and they claimed themselves Kharâbâti. There are indigenous Kharâbâti from blood, like all these ustads we mentioned, like Ustad Qasim, Ustad Qasim Ju, Ustad Sattar Ju, Ustad Gulam Hussain, father of Ustad Sarahan, and many others. But these Kharâbâtis, either they are indigenous or not, or adoptive, which I call them adoptive of Kharâbât, they don't have, unfortunately, a proper network as such that we can be kind of in touch or could be a reference and address. It doesn't exist, unfortunately. There are, how can I say that, shareholder of Kharâbât, like Ustad Eldar Hussain, the son of Sarahan, or Fatahan, they are in Canada, Ustad Gulam Hussain in Germany, Ustad Nazari, who's student of Ustad Sarahan, was not from Kharâbât, it's from the royal family, or many others. They don't have a kind of a circle or establishment or an organization or an association which could be looked into it and established it somehow. Maybe, I don't know, in the future, if I can, I would have to do this.
Do you think that they would greet that proposal with approval?
Certainly, if there is a diplomatic way to approach this. If we go from the top, would be more easily acceptable, like coming from Ustad Sarahan family or Ustad Asif family, for example, here in London, or Ustad Sharif Ghazal in Germany. These are the big heads. We can talk to them and we can get them together and maybe establish such a circuit.
And how would such a circuit sort of work? What would it?
They are basically in touch by WhatsApp and many other tools. They call themselves each other, they talk to each other, but they don't have an organization. They are attached, of course they are attached.
So in fact, one route would be to somehow apply to whoever awards these intangible heritage recognitions to say we want to be recognized.
Yes,
as you have mentioned.
of course, for everything there is a procedure. We have to approach UNESCO. We have to approach the head of UNESCO, for example, here in England, who is representative. I know the head of UNESCO in Germany. I spoke to them last couple of weeks ago, exactly on the 4th of June. She accepted the idea. She said, yes, that's a wonderful idea, etc. Because I started the Safar project in Germany in 2012. They know me and we work a lot together with France University, where I may do my PhD. That's another matter. But this is somehow accepted, the idea. Now it needs to be developed and
Money.
find funding that I can travel around and go see these people and convince them, get their consent that they are agreeing in such an idea and come together and we can form some kind of association, or we call it demand.
Yeah.
But in the traditional quarter, how does their religious practice differ from wider Afghan society? I understand that they are different by virtue of being regarded as being from a group that was brought in from the outside. But on top of that, do they have some distinctive religious practice?
Absolutely not. They are considered as an Afghan and Muslim, and they do claim themselves pure Afghan, because I can see why, and it's clear historically that there was no border before the invasion of British Empire, and for many centuries. Dr. Rajan is there with your permission. For many centuries, Afghans ruled India from 10th century to 16th century, including the period of Mughal era. So the cultural exchange and interconnection and cohesion did exist already. But in religious perspective, they were Muslims, accepted Islam, and there were no secular Hindu practitioner of music in kharâbât at the court of kings.
But what about what brotherhood did they follow?
The brotherhood was absolutely fine, because next to Ustad Rahim Bakhsh's house, exactly adjacent to his house, was the Sikh temple, Dharamsala, was just next door. The cohesion existed in this quarter as well, and the interconnection and brotherhood without being the same religion.
So they weren't member of any particular Sufi brotherhood? Because these songs are pure Sufi songs.
There was on a park for many years, just outside Kharâbât, not inside Kharâbât.
On the edge.
Yeah, on the edge of Kharâbât. One was at the time of Ustad Hussain in the Wazir Lahori. There was a gathering, a saint who organized this gathering, and Ustad Hussain was going in to sing, and Tito Khanam was also performing, a lady from India was performing, who became the wife of Ustad Hussain later. After this area, there was another one in Kuchis and Tarashi. There was a most famous Khanaqah. It's called Khwaja Mahidin Chishti Khanaqah, where all these kharâbâti musicians was performing, and this Sufi brotherhood was existing outside Kuchi Kharâbât as well as inside Kuchi Kharâbât.
I think you wanted to add something to this.
No, I have a few questions, but
I've been-
please finish.
Okay, not exactly on the theme, but that's very interesting, basically. Yeah, so they were kind of, they weren't necessarily a Sufi order in themselves, but they were loosely affiliated with a particular
50 tradition, yeah.
with
50
the
order.
order.
And they were claiming that they are followers, of course, because the musicians are automatically follower of Chishti tradition because they perform at the shrine.
Okay. Okay. All right. And a final question before we turn to our colleague. Were the ideas of Muhyiddin Arabi ever all the texts of Muhyiddin Arabi ever part of this? Did they get that far?
I can chauvinism doesn't allow them because we consider that Khaja Muhyiddin Chishti come from Chishti study from Herat, and that's belong to us, and we follow this Sufi rather than any others.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Now I understand for the first time. I'm very, very grateful to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think it was very fascinating and very enlightening because this is the first time I'm listening about and hearing about this group. So this is really amazing and it leaves me with a few questions. And I'm sorry if I missed the answer before I joined because I was a few years late. So first, how kharâbâtam distinguish himself from other Sufi groups, because it seems that they are identifying themselves as kharâbâtam, but they're also Sufis. So is there any one or two markers that like they say that this is what distinguish us from the rest of the others? And even in the music, I was thinking that we have a tradition of Baily in India from Emeritus and that time, and they kind of like trace back their roots from India as well. So is there any overlaps that we see between these two? Because in hearing, definitely, other than the instruments, definitely there is some kind of rhythm that you can pick between what they were singing and what qawwals do, and the way the gharana of qawwals run, the family lineage, they're very proud about that. Similarly, I can see the same trend in them as well. So if we can draw some reflection on this tradition and the other one. Thirdly, I was thinking that very dominantly it was the male musicians that we see playing and being part of it. I wonder that even women, even in concealment, but was it in prisons? The similar tradition of music and playing or writing the songs within female kharâbâtam, I don't know, like if it is really exclusive to men. And lastly, I was wondering that from where, like you shed light upon the meanings and the significance of the word kharâbâtam that people uphold, and they try to draw their values from what kharâbâtam would mean. But at the same time, is it the term that they have given to themselves, or it was being gifted to them by someone else? And I'm sorry again if any of these questions were answered before in this talk.
Well, clearly it's a very ambiguous term.
Yeah.
And as the authority that I mentioned and our anonymous scribe kind of comes up with exactly the same idea, is that the kharâbât was the naughty place. It was the tavern is where you went to get drunk. But the way around that is to somehow see that in that drunken state, somehow you are improving your spiritual value, to put it rather strangely. In the terms of, sorry, I'm a bit incoherent today, but clearly one could make many interesting comparisons between qawwali and the whole lineage of Qawwali singers and so on. And at some point, maybe somebody will do that. But there is another aspect to all of this which helps us to understand the kind of marginal role, position of the kharâbât musicians, and that is a very important distinction within Afghan culture between the professional musician and the amateur musician, between the kesbi, the person who earns his living from performing music, and the shaykhi, who has music as a hobby, and this is a very important distinction. Like, for example, the dutar player who you may have seen here definitely is from a non-musician family, and he went to school. He had some role in the wool market as a tallyman or something, but he was very mad about playing the dutar, and despite the protestations of his family, he ends up as being, a very prominent player, performer on this instrument. But in my fieldwork on the dutar in Herat, I constantly came across this feeling of that, I loved the dutar as a boy. I could hear it played in the tea house, but my family were absolutely dead against it. Even our anonymous scribe, when I knew him years ago in Herat, he was very upset one time because he had been practicing the dutar during Muharram, and his family were from that position, and they'd taken his dutar and smashed it against the wall, just like a talib might do. And that kind of experience was by no means unique to him. People treated having a connection with music with nervousness, that they didn't want it to be known that, Karim Duchari, one of the prominent dutar players, said, my family were against it because then what will the neighbors say? The neighbors say, you're bringing up your son as a musician. And that's wrong, you should be doing some proper respectable work. So a very brief glimpse of this whole Shaykhi, Kesbi division. That was something that had, in the 1970s, was already not melting away, but becoming less important. And I've no doubt with the rubab players, it's the same position. I mean, all these student rubab players that I would mix with when I was going for my rubab lessons in Amir Ustad's house, they were from middle class, educated families. They weren't having a problem in Kabul with what the neighbours were saying, or if they would be very circumspect about it. Some of them were students from the university. Some of them they were generally young people. So that was okay at that time. I mean, it is something I'm sure Mirais would agree that had changed a lot over the years as Afghanistan had become a more modern, outward-looking country, and going from the time of even the Amirs, then gradually music acquired a more respectable facade, and even Abdul Rahman, the Iron Amir boasts. I mean, I can't read it, but I've never seen it. But boasts in his memoirs, we've got all these good musicians, very good rubab players, and I'm a very good rubab player too. He was proud, in fact, that it was very important in the nurturing of the kharâbât that they had royal patronage from the outset. I see that, because it was court music. I think that the person who said, "Oh, we must get some musicians up from Hindustan," as it then was, he had been impressed. This conference in Ambala, it's about 1860 or something or other, when the Amir had a big kind of meeting with the British ambassador in Hindustan at that time, whatever he was. The Afghans would no longer have any dealings with the Russians, you know, and he thought in his travel to Ambala, it's very near this other city that is famous for the music. I mentioned it, I can't remember it offhand.
Lahore.
No, Lahore. Where's that hanging?
Patiala.
Yeah, Patiala. It's very close to Ambala. I believe, I mean, I'm guessing, you know, people nip over to Patiala of an evening and enjoy the court music there. So your question has made me realise that how important this royal patronage was, and you know the great Ustad Hussain, who was you know given a very important title by the king.
Also, the king himself was a disciple of Ustad Hussain at that point, so that was giving another perspective to music and musician of kharâbât, as he became himself a student of Ustad Hussain at that point and called him Ustad himself. And there are many anecdotes. One of the anecdotes is very interesting that my own teacher explained to me. So there was a gathering in Pahman, nearby Kabul, and king was there, and Ustad was performing until late night. And next day he was in his tent resting, and the king was waked up and dressed up, etc., and was waiting, receiving his Ustad, and his Ustad was late, so he didn't go quickly to see the king. So later he arrived, and king was standing looking out, and without turning himself towards his Ustad, said, "Ustad, you are late." And Ustad, he was very notorious person, and he said, "You may be king, but I'm your teacher." So, and then he turned and laughed and hacked him and so on. So so many anecdotes like this does exist, and this was one of the tools for democratization of music, that word I use always, through the royal family, and became more popular amongst other aristocratic family, like Muhammad Zaid family, all those people learn music. To find a very important one. What is the kharâbâtam means? I am from Kharâbât. It doesn't. Kharâbât is the place. Kharâbâti is the person who belongs to Kharâbât. Kharâbâtam, I am from Kharâbât. Janan-e Kharabatam, I am the soul of Kharâbât. So that's one question. And on the Qawwali part, we have to mention that Amir Khusraw, he may be called the Alawi, he's from Balkh. He's Balkhi. So Qawwali also traveled a lot and came to India through these Afghan Sufi mystic missionaries like ourselves. I'm a Khoja from background. So we were traveling from Hijaz to Bukhara, and to propage Islam at that time, and the time of Ottoman. So these people travel a lot to come to India, and especially to propage Islam. And then the Chishti tradition, through Sufism, a lot of people became Muslim in India rather than the jihad. So the jihad is a very fashionable recent word, propage Islam, but at the time it was Sufism. So the the poet, Sufi, musician, accountant of the court was Amir Khasraw from Baily. And
that's absolutely fascinating. I'm conscious though that we need to also not exclude our online colleagues. So we'll carry on the discussion because of course it reminds one very strongly of the Seljuks and the Mevlevis, of course.
yes,
They're absolutely parallel. But look, but Kate Fitzgibbon has been waiting very patiently. Are you able to connect her so she could?
She also wrote in the chat that she had to leave.
Oh,
so
I'm
not
sorry,
sure
Kate. If you're
she's
still here,
with
then
us. Let's see.
do ask your question now.
Let's see if I still, Kate, are you still with us? You can unmute now if you are.
Unfortunately, she's had to go.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. There is also, besides the Q&A, there's questions in the chat as well.
Yes, yes. So you're welcome, Vitiven, if you would like to ask your question live, just put your hand up if you're still with us. Not everybody likes to answer the question live, but
David, while you're trying to round them up, we have a intervention.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I mean, in terms of this sort of Qawwali and the music in the kharâbât, is there any sort of, and I don't know if I have books on Kabul, well, I can't remember if I've gone through this to look for it. Is there a sort of sense of repertoire coming from the musicians coming from India, like poetry, like, I mean, we were talking about this sort of the musicians being either Chishti or anything, but Chishti's also sang poetry, Jân-e, who's Naqshbandi, and very different from Chishti. So was there a sort of set repertoire that was coming from like Satarju and all these people that is still performed, or is it sort of much kind of shifting and changing repertoire? Like detail becomes much more popular.
I have to refer this to my brain here.
The repertoire at the beginning, as Dr. Baily said, was mainly Ghazal singing by Ustad Qasim, who introduced this Ghazal tradition into this Latin form. And all those songs Ustad Qasim and Ustad Shaida especially was singing in the beginning of the 20th century was somehow Sufi sound. From Jân-e, from Mawlana, most of them from Waqif, or from Said Tabrizi, Dehlavi Tabrizi, that's Indian tradition poet. These are all Sufi poetry anyway, or from Sana'i. Sana'i is the first one, by the way, who used the word kharâbât in poetry, and term of Sufi tradition. Out of this bar and tabla and so on. So he was the first one who referred kharâbât word as a Sufi word.
What sort of date is that then?
It's 10th century.
From Ghazna.
Sorry, just yeah, from Ghazna at the time of Sultan Mahmud. Before that, it's before that. So the repertoire then existed in a different shape, or in a different, especially beat. The Qawwali tradition is all about the beat, how the beat is going on, and this lyrics is divided on those beats, if I may. Otherwise, the poetry, this same poetry, you can sing it as a ghazal with a different beat, like Yaktala, Kerwa, I don't know, Chintal. But the Qawwali beat is a specific beat that bring you this atmosphere of, how do you say that, ecstasy.
May I just add to this conversation on the qawwals, because I'm a first year PhD student
doing my doctoral research on a specific lineage of qawwals that migrated from the shrine of Nizamuddin and settled in Pakistan in Karachi. And interestingly, I've seen one of the qawwals taught, their students were at the Patiala court, Ustad Ashik Ali Khan, and the khayal that then, from my knowledge, also taught Ustad Sarahang.
Yes.
And so I guess, you know, and I've seen Ustad Sarahang performing even Qawwali on YouTube. There's a video of him. So it's interesting that even Qawwali as a repertoire is performed by Afghan musicians, even though it comes from Khusro. So there's like this musical exchange that has been taking place for many, many centuries, like, you know, we all know. But I was kind of curious to know what other musicians came from, you mentioned Lahore and Patiala, and if we have names of those musicians that came and maybe taught the musicians in Kharâbât. That was one question. And then the other one is, forgive my very basic rudimentary Persian, but I noticed that you translated Chun-e Jân-e Kharabatam. So Chun, I guess, would mean why, but it's translated as I am the soul of Khabar. So why is it not why am I not? So what is Chun? If you could just
means because there is two meanings.
Okay, right.
Chun Chera means why?
Yeah.
Chera is why, Chun came.
In Herat, if somebody asks you, Chuni means how are you? It is a different meaning in a different context.
Yes. Okay, because, yeah, right.
Because.
And is the Kharâbâti musicians, are we talking about a specific style of Hindustani music that came and was practiced, or is there, like, this is a guild, were there other guilds like the Kharâbâti that kind of settled across Afghanistan, I suppose? So one is who were like the musicians that came from Lahore and Patiala, if we know anything about them, and then if there are other guilds like the Kharâbâti, musicians that perform this classical Hindustani with, you know.
I have to plead ignorance, not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge, but certainly Afghanistan had a well-developed kind of guild culture for these locksmiths and jewelers and etc., etc. So to have that kind of shagird, you know, a student journeyman, as we call them. I mean, the journeyman is called a journeyman because he's somebody who can travel, you know, with his skills, and then finally, you know, the master craftsman, the ustad. Somebody in Switzerland, I can't, Pierre, somebody or other, has written about these guilds in Afghanistan. Sorry, I don't any more reply to that. I was wondering that Liam wanted to have something to say on, and I have a question for you, Liam, and that is in your researches on poetry in Gujarat, including in Persian language, or does the word kharâbât come up in the text you've looked at?
I'm sure it's not something that I've kind of picked out, but I mean, it's a very sort of potent Sufistic symbol that is carried across many different sort of traditions, both in, I mean, I'm sure even in like early Hindi poetry and Persian poetry as in Gujarat as well. But there's nothing like specific that I can say I found.
No.
Yeah, but I'm sure it's.
Can I add to your question? There are musicians coming from other cities like Sur and Kashmir. There are musicians from Kashmir, Satarju is from Kashmir, for example, and all his Islamic family, Mamuddin and Karimbash, they are from Kashmir, and those Sarang's family come from Shahpurabad, which is now Peshawar today. He originally comes from this area, his father, and Ustad Karimbash family come from Lahore. So there are musicians coming from other cities. On the guild questions, there are many guilds. It's the tradition I wrote about the Gurmani tradition in Kharâbât, my master thesis, and there are discussion about other guilds in that paper. I give example of people who become goldsmith or ironsmith or other carpenter even. They have to go to their ustads and stay there as a shagird, as a apprentice for many years, and until they become a good learner and represent his ustad and his teacher, then the ustad give him not the worst type bandana, but the small gulisi. There is a something that's like a bill tied around his waist and give him the kind of prayer and benediction that he can carry on this job after himself. So it does exist in northern Afghanistan, in western Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan, everywhere, that somebody become student of some craftsman master. The craftsman master give him this benediction that he can carry on. That exists, yes.
Sorry, one more. There's this kind of quite famous French documentary on Sufism in Afghanistan. I don't know if you've seen it. Because there is a scene of them in the Khanaqah of them performing ghazal and they're playing instruments, and I was wondering if you knew who those musicians were.
If that had been a Khanaqah in Kabul.
I think so.
I think I've seen it, yes.
Somehow, but
I mean, it was a very accessible Khanaqah.
Yeah,
right.
Khanaqah is it's
We do have some questions online that we're kind of committed to answering, and so first one is that they're curious about the Sufi dimension of the music before the time frame we learned about today. In other words, do the Indian roots lend themselves to Sufi themes, or are there big changes when they move in order to fit into the Afghan context? Yes, are we talking about a tradition migrating in or a tradition being recreated?
both ways.
Questions like that just make me feel very ignorant. I don't know the answer. Any other?
Another question? Well, I suppose one thing one could say is, what did they say themselves in the musicians' quarter? What did they say before they were dispersed? Did they say we represent a pure tradition from outside, or would they regard themselves as being internally generated music, as it were? Is there any consciousness of that?
Again, the otherwise probably has a better answer than I. He's the expert.
I'm the guilty. To your question regarding the inward and outwards, this Sufi tradition, I think firstly, I have to explain that this Indo-Afghan connection, Afghan after the 1747, we talk about Afghanistan before there was other names. And if you want to talk about the territory that exists now, the tradition between the two now today's country existed since 2000 years before our Christian era.
Right.
From the Gandhara tradition and Gandhara finding, you can see there are musicians performing on that relief that is found in Kandahar civilization's time. So this and Taxila, this going in and out between India and Afghanistan with the Buddhism, there was for 6th century Buddhism was the main religion of Afghanistan. So no one can ignore this. That was part of that. Kushani was this period of time. All this Kushani jewelry that travel around the world, including here and in Germany, 4,000 years before, we had this skeleton tradition and this highly regarded culture. But it was mixed, of course, between the Indian Maharaja from other side and kingdom from inside Afghanistan, or Mar, Bukhara, Herat was also a very important place at the time before becoming Balkh as a capital. That was also a very important place. So these kingdoms did play roles amongst their Maharaja in India as well together. And I'm sure when I refer to Ghurid dynasty or Ghaznavid dynasty, when they went to India, that I explained to our Minister of Culture, unfortunately once I had to, because he asked me, oh, hello, Mirais, are you still with your Raga system? I said, yes, I am. This Raga belongs to us. If we give it to India, that's your choice. But that belongs to all of us. It's from India to Afghanistan, from Afghanistan to India. That was my explanation. That at the time of Ghurid dynasty or Ghaznavid dynasty or after, when people traveled, including the kingdom and so on, to India, to Delhi, surely they brought with them some sort of cultural tradition that the Indian picked up. And from other side, when the Buddhism was part of our tradition, we also picked up traditions, music, jewelry, clothing, etc. So I think this is for both sides to answer your question. There was not only one way. And Kharâbât's Sufi tradition that existed before arrival of Kharâbâti musicians from India. That I'm ignorant about this, I don't know. But surely, as I mentioned before, the musical tradition traveled to India, from India back to Afghanistan with like Shor, Muhammad Shor, became Baily Raga, to come back to Afghanistan with another name. And I mean, that's I without.
Very important. No, that's absolutely fine. There's another question here. So Alexandra Balandina.
Oh, my student.
Well, there we are. Alexandra would like to say, it's wonderful that you could record in sound and written form this great music tradition from the 1970s. My question is whether your recorded material from your fieldwork, and of course Veronica's fieldwork, has been used by the Afghan diaspora to relearn their own musical tradition. So in other words, are people taking your recordings and using it themselves to learn their own traditions again?
Well, I looked up Qasim Baksh, the singer that we saw there. I love his singing, his Dutch expressive face. And there was that song that I recorded. It's from a film. The film is called Scenes of Afghan Music, London, Kabul, Hamburg, and Ireland. Okay, and there's 10, 15 minutes on each. So Qasim Baksh was the stuff I put in from Kabul into that film. And then, anybody can get hold of that and put it up on YouTube or whatever internet it was. And that, I think, lots of one's materials ended up like that, since I'm not an avid internet kind of user, checking up who's stolen what or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I don't feel it belongs to me, but certainly I'm pleased when things that I have dealt with have passed on to others. Nobody's making a lot of money out of this, not even me.
But your collection now is in British Library, is that correct?
Yeah, all the field recordings that we made in Herat in between 1973 and 77, all of those tapes are now in the British Library, awaiting digitization, awaiting an expert. I can't think who could do it, who could give an expert identification, because a lot of that stuff, you know, the latest pop songs or Hindi movie songs or whatever. But well, guess what? British Library hasn't got a lot of money to pay somebody. I mean, they do have people who digitize things all the time, but that the Baily Doubleday collection, as it's called, is awaiting treatment. And nothing much has happened.
I could display 50 of them, not more.
I mean, there's not just the recordings, but there's also the rubab handbook, which is a
That's
very useful teaching tool.
Sure, but I mean, besides those recordings, there are all the because of my role as a RAI film fellow. What was my title?
Yes, I think you were at the time.
Okay, and sent to the National Film and Television School for 2 years. Then I started making movies, and my film Amir is the classic and a prize-winning film. But then I made all these things that I call fieldwork movies. So instead of taking a tape recorder, I took a camera, and that's how these things have come about. So there's all of that material, my dear. When I look at the stacks of material and all the cassettes and this, that, and the other, I tremble with fear at the work that awaits me in retirement. David, I think we should wrap up now.
Yeah, absolutely. Starting. Right. So thank you very much indeed for an absolutely marvelous presentation.
Well, thank you.